To understand modern Israeli security, you have to look closely at two specific locations: Baghdad, Iraq, and Deir ez-Zor, Syria. These cities were the testing grounds for the Begin Doctrine. Formulated in the late 1970s and 1980s by Prime Minister Menachem Begin, this policy draws an absolute red line. Israel will not tolerate the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction by any hostile regional state. For decades prior, Israel relied on passive deterrence. The Begin Doctrine replaced that calculus, shifting the national defense posture toward proactive threat elimination. Implementing this strategy creates an immediate tension. It forces a collision between the survival of a nation and the rigid sovereignty principles of international law. Because of this friction, the doctrine operates in a geopolitical gray zone. Every execution creates shockwaves that force the international community to reevaluate the line between aggression and self-defense. The first major test of this policy arrived in 1981. Operation Opera was a highly public, overt airstrike against an Iraqi nuclear reactor that sparked immediate global controversy. 26 years later, Israel executed Operation Orchard against a nuclear facility in Syria. But this time, the doctrine had evolved into a modern, covert instrument. Both operations challenged a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the global framework designed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons through diplomacy and inspections rather than military force. Looking at these two strikes side by side reveals a critical evolution. The diplomatic fallout from 1981 forced a dramatic adaptation in how the Begin Doctrine was executed in 2007. By comparing these two operations, we can isolate the specific variables required to dismantle a state's nuclear program without triggering a full-scale regional war. In 1976, Iraq purchased an Osirak-class nuclear reactor from France and renamed it Tammuz 1. As established in this view of the Osirak facility, the project was massive and physically unmistakable. Because the reactor was an open secret, Israeli intelligence agencies, Mossad and Amman, actively monitored its construction for years, using human intelligence and satellite imagery to track Iraq's nuclear progress. Decades later, the threat in Syria looked very different. This overhead aerial view of the Al-Khaybar site shows a nondescript industrial building in a remote desert, designed specifically to hide its true purpose from the world. Intelligence eventually revealed that this isolated building was a nuclear reactor, built with direct assistance from North Korean experts and operating entirely outside of international oversight. Unlike the Iraqi program, which was a subject of public debate for years, the discovery of Al-Khaybar was kept strictly classified. Handling the intelligence this way prevented any diplomatic leaks that could alert Syria before Israel acted. The physical visibility of the target dictated the intelligence posture. Iraq's public reactor allowed for a long lead time, while Syria's concealed facility required a timeline of total secrecy. On June 7, 1981, the strike force took off. It relied on F-16As for the primary attack and F-15s to provide air cover, flying in a tight formation to slip past early warning radars. Reaching Baghdad was a logistical nightmare, requiring the pilots to fly 600 miles while violating both Jordanian and Saudi airspace. To bypass radar detection, they used tactical deception. In Jordanian airspace, pilots spoke Saudi-accented Arabic and claimed to be a lost patrol. Over Saudi Arabia, they utilized Jordanian radio signals to maintain the ruse. Once they reached the reactor, the F-16s delivered Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs. These were fitted with delay-action fuses, allowing them to penetrate the containment dome and detonate inside the reactor core. The operation was launched on a Sunday afternoon. Planners chose this window to minimize the presence of foreign experts and civilians, aiming to destroy the facility while limiting the loss of life. This operational design cemented a key pillar of the Begin Doctrine, an emphasis on precise, targeted lethality to remove a strategic threat without resorting to mass destruction. Operation Orchard abandoned the complex public theater of 1981, opting instead for a mission defined by absolute stealth and operational minimalism. Secrecy was total. Throughout the planning and execution, only a tiny circle of officials knew the mission existed, ensuring the element of surprise remained intact until the target was destroyed. In 2007, plausible deniability became the primary weapon deployed after the bombs were dropped. Israel chose to remain completely silent about the success of the strike, refusing to issue press releases or even publicly claim credit for the mission. Weaponizing this silence allowed the Syrian leadership to save face. By not being forced to publicly admit to a violation of their sovereignty, Syria avoided the pressure to retaliate, neutralizing the threat while preventing a regional war. The 1981 strike on Iraq triggered an immediate, universal backlash. Media outlets and the UN Security Council joined in condemnation, passing Resolution 3627 to denounce the act of aggression. This creates the preemption paradox, a phenomenon where unilateral defensive strikes are initially condemned but eventually vindicated by shifting history. Global perspectives on the 1981 strike shifted during the 1991 Gulf War. Faced with the threat of an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the international community realized the implications of a nuclear-armed Saddam Hussein. Years later, U.S. officials acknowledged that the 1981 strike prevented a nuclear disaster, effectively providing retroactive vindication for the operation. Contrast this 10-year wait for vindication with the 2007 Al-Kibar strike, which was met with almost no international response. Because Syria could not admit to hosting an illicit nuclear facility, the international community was able to largely ignore the strike, bypassing the cycle of public condemnation. These variables show how the Begin Doctrine adapted into a refined geopolitical tool. Covert mitigation was the primary lesson learned. By integrating plausible deniability, a state can remove a threat without triggering the diplomatic fallout of an overt attack. This strategy recognizes a psychological reality. Publicly claiming a strike forces an adversary to retaliate to maintain their legitimacy. Covert execution allows them to back down quietly. Ultimately, these operations highlight the limitations of international treaties. When diplomacy fails to deter a bad actor, the global non-proliferation regime lacks its own physical enforcement mechanism. While it violates traditional state sovereignty, the adapted Begin Doctrine has proven to be a highly effective, if controversial, backstop for regional stability.